You've probably seen recent headlines with Greta Thunberg and her blah 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 tirade, not to mention Her Majesty the Queen's comments over frustration on the inaction in the area of climate change. No doubt today, climate change is one of the hottest topics, and understandably so, because if you were to delve into the empirical evidence and really look at it, you see that climate is a pressing issue that really challenges the future of our entire planet. But despite the fact that many of us might take proactive steps to try and reduce our carbon footprints or our emissions, the fact remains that businesses are truly in the greatest position of impacts, and the onus has to be on them because of their scale and their contribution. Businesses and industries, they contribute the most to carbon emissions every single year globally. But despite the fact that they are in such position of change and they could truly make a difference, the way that businesses are designed within the framework of the economic systems of the world is such that they aren't really incentivized to do anything about it. Businesses are designed really to generate profit, to chase financial gain, and to reduce carbon emissions doesn't really fit within the paradigm of doing a business at all. Oftentimes it represents an unnecessary cost that doesn't actually fit within the bill of running the business itself. And so this is where the idea of the carbon market first emerged. What if businesses could be geared differently? You probably may have heard of the carbon market term before, and oftentimes it is overcomplicated. So today let's try and simplify it, see how it actually works, and see whether it actually works. To really delve into this, we must first understand the cap-and-trade system. This all came about in the 1980s and 1990s, where in the United States, through the period of industrialization and post-industrialization, there's really a rise of sulfur dioxide, which is generated from industrial activity. And this actually caused sulfuric rain, in other words, acid rain. And this is truly problematic. It represents not only an ecological concern, but also a health concern. So in the late 80s and later on, finally in the 90s, the United States government decided to do something about it. They introduced a cap-and-trade system, essentially to cap the amount of emissions in terms of sulfur dioxide that industries could actually generate within the United States, and to penalize them if they go past this cap. And so all of a sudden businesses were incentivized to not create too much sulfur dioxide. And after actually enacting this from 1990 to 2019, there has been a reduction in sulfur dioxide by 93%. In other words, this has been a very successful program. So by 1992, at the Climate Convention in Kyoto, where we have seen global rise in carbon emissions, it was proposed that countries actually adopt this cap-and-trade system and integrate it within economies to cap carbon emissions. And many countries actually decided to pursue this. So how it actually works is that governments will actually create a ceiling in industries towards the amount of carbon emissions they can generate, this maximum amount. And based on this ceiling, they will allocate permits and sell permits to businesses that may want to buy them in their generation of carbon emissions. Now, if a business actually surpasses their permits, they will be penalized. Now, if a business doesn't actually surpass the permit, they can also sell their permits to other businesses that may buy the permits from one another. In other words, it is very much like a market. And so this idea was really to try and encourage a shift in terms of the corporate responsibility of businesses by redefining the incentive of businesses in terms of how they tackle emissions. See, under this system, businesses would be disincentivized to produce too much emissions because they may be penalized. At the same time, they may also be incentivized because if they were to keep within the emissions or even way below the emissions, they can also sell those permits to other businesses and make money. In other words, this scheme was designed within the language of business, hopefully to promote progressive action here. And so we have a situation where businesses may be incentivized to actually be mindful of the emissions they generate, but not only that, not only in a passive way, but also progressively see whether they can innovate, because governments may lower the ceiling progressively every year. And so there's also an incentive for businesses to try and innovate their processes and become more climate friendly. So this is truly a brilliant idea. And if the sulfur dioxide case study is anything to go by, then the carbon market could potentially, at least in theory, bring about a significant reduction in carbon emissions from its greatest contributors. Yet despite the fact that we have this great theory, the practice of the carbon market has been quite different. We haven't really seen a significant global shift in terms of a reduction of carbon emissions since the carbon market has been introduced in many countries, since the Kyoto Protocol. And the reason why is because, first of all, for many countries around the world, the carbon permits themselves are actually not that expensive to purchase. And a lot of research groups have actually done studies that in order for us to meet our global ideal targets of carbon emissions, the current price for carbon per ton should be much higher than what we're seeing now globally. At the same time, the penalty that we have seen in the carbon markets in many countries for actually surpassing the limit that they're allocated based on their permits has often been the same as the price of the permit itself. And so businesses have not really been disincentivized to violating the carbon market itself. Not to mention there's also this third issue of enforcement. It has been very difficult for many countries to actively enforce and actually monitor whether a certain business is actually following its allocated carbon permits. And so we really have an issue where, in theory, although it is great, in practice, it is actually a bit different. And not to mention that in the very same way of how the globe tried to tackle the coronavirus, where it is very hard to unify everyone's responses, the actual enforcement and creation of the carbon market around the world is totally different. Some countries don't have one at all. They've chosen not to ratify it. Some countries have it, but to varying degrees and levels of enforcement. And so carbon contributions globally is totally different. In some countries, it is more significant. And this has also caused an issue of leakage, or let's say an international business that is generating a lot of emissions. They may decide, rather than to, for example, be in a certain country where they're very strict about the carbon market, they could also relocate to another country that has less enforcement and operate out of that. And so we have seen in the world, there are certain countries, like for example, China, where emission levels are truly exorbitant. And so what we can see is that although the theory of the carbon market is great, in practice it is actually very, very difficult to realize such a market, especially in the context of this global challenge. We really truly need global intervention, yet there's a challenge of individual sovereignties of different countries that may decide to pursue the policy differently or not pursue it at all. Certainly there have been arguments where lesser developed countries have said that the carbon market is justified in a developing country because they're very well developed, but certain countries, they need more development, and this isn't the sort of policy that they want to pursue. And perhaps a sort of solution that we need is a type of global carbon tax, where despite wherever you are, as long as the good is produced from a certain country with a certain level of emission, universally there should be a tax applied to that. If we can somehow unify everyone in terms of actually ratifying it together, but that of course is very difficult. This is still very far-fetched. But the fact remains that if we're looking at recent trends, there has been more regulation that's been developing globally around the world in actually enforcing, creating and realizing a carbon market. And what is so fascinating, despite the fact that you might think that there's still much inaction here, is that for the first time in human history, in all the previous centuries, this is actually now in the collective zeitgeist of industries and of course governance. So we will definitely see much more developments here going forward. And as much as we can see how these things actually work beautifully in theory, the practical implementation of these great ideas and schemes really does require delicate and careful planning, especially from the standpoint of governance. So whatever it may be going forward in the future, where we have already created markets out of many things, carbon is certainly today one of those things.